When a young hero rescued a native child, 500 warriors showed up, and what arrived on the horizon would ask the whole town to choose what kind of people they would become. Eli Turner knew the sound of a blizzard before he saw it. The wind came first, a low compression of air that pushed the grasses flat and whistled through fence slats like 100 small mouths. Then the snow began to fall in sheets, not the soft whisper of winter, but the hard, slicing stitch that put itself between a man and the things he needed to see. The year was 1873. The place was Red River Crossing, a scattering of cabins and shops along a span of road that took whatever patience the prairie had left and tested it some more. For Eli, 15 was a number on a calendar he had stopped counting. Being 13 felt more accurate in the face of the cold. He lived as most town orphans did in that place, in the spaces everyone passed by. He woke when the sun was a promise under grey, checked his snares and traps, mended a torn leather strap, and traded what he could for a crust of bread or a warm corner by a stove. His kit was small and practical, a set of rabbit fur mittens, moccasins with a patina from miles of wet grass, a length of rope, a pocket knife with a chip in the handle, and a cast-iron skillet he used over fires and at Mrs. Hanley's table. He moved with the economy of someone taught to measure breath by need. He kept his back to the wind and his face to whatever shelter he could find. The town treated him like a weathered thing. People greeted him with the same casual lack of attention they gave to the wind. He was useful when their men needed a hand with a broken fence or a night watch on an empty barn, and invisible when the town wanted to speak of politics and boundaries and blame. Eli had learned that invisibility could be a kindness. Nobody expected much, so nobody blamed him for failure. That knowledge was both armor and ache. On the morning the blizzard rolled in hard enough to make the river look as though it might freeze solid in a breath, Eli had been checking snares near a bend in the river known by older trappers as Rabbit's Hollow. The world closed quickly. Snow rose in waves, his hair crusted with frost. He would later remember the way the day narrowed to small things, the thickening of his breath, the birds that fell silent, the way a stray bootlace could become a puzzle the size of a winter. He wrapped his scarf tighter, cupped his hands, and counted off steps by the method he'd taught himself. 3 for a reach, 5 for a turn, then another 7 to check the stones, until a sound cut across the wind. It was a voice small as a bell. It came and went like a thought, a thread of calling half lost to the storm. Eli stopped. The noise could have been the wind turning itself into words. He listened until it happened again. A breathy cry, not quite English, higher than a man's, and with a fear so sharp it pulled his chest forward. He found her face first, a small oval peeking from under a drift, lashes rimed with white, breath so shallow the wind could have snuffed it. He knelt and scraped, fingers numb, until he had cleared the snow to the shoulders. A bundle of fur and beadwork and tiny moccasins emerged. A child's body curled against itself, a small medicine pouch at her throat, a strip of leather with seed beads glinting like a cluster of frozen berries. Her skin was the color of well-cooked bread. A smear of frost had traced her cheek. She had left behind a track, a tiny, straight line, where a boot or a moccasin had cut through the new snow from the direction of the river, and then ended. Eli worked fast on instinct. He was not a healer, but he knew enough to be careful. He brushed the hair from her brow and felt for a pulse that was a ghost. He warmed his palms between his arms and cupped them at her neck. He pulled her hood up to shelter what he could. There was the sharp sting of fear as he tugged away a frozen mitten and found a small hand with a bracelet of braided hide. She had a name in the way her breath came. An arrangement of vowels and consonants Eli couldn't place. "Hey," he said in the soft, small voice men used with wounded birds. "Hey, you there?" Her lashes trembled. She opened one eye, and the color of her gaze matched the flat winter sky. She said a word he hadn't learned in any of his travels around town. He recognized the sound as a name when his own lips formed, "Kaya?" The syllables rested between them, unfamiliar and vital. He tore off his own scarf and wrapped it around her shoulders, laid his parka under her head as if the ground could be tricked into warmth, and wrapped both of them in a length of rope he used to keep a supply of kindling on his back. He had a stubborn, youthful certainty at work, a rule he had not learned in books. You could not leave a child to the snow. He dug a shallow trench against a drift and buried the edges of their bedding to cut the wind, then set his back to the opening to hold a little of the heat in. He had a tin flask of black coffee in a pocket. He warmed it by the fire he struck with flint, and let the steam rise, not to pour near her lips, but to breathe in so she would feel something warm nearby. He pressed his hands against her feet, where the moccasins were soaked through and hissed with cold. He had seen frostbite in a man's hands once, and it had looked like something stolen. He slid off her moccasins and wrapped her toes in the extra fur he had, pulling her socks up and pinching them close. The skin of her ankle was pale, but it blinked under his touch, not yet surrendered to ice. When she finally let her eyes open for longer, she reached for the bracelet at her throat. Eli saw a medallion tied to a strip of leather, a carved disc small as the top of a coin, and beneath it a bit of hair tied with thread. Her fingers trembled. She said his name, or at least the sound she would use for him after watching him pull the snow away. "My name," she said, concentrating. It came out halting. "Kaya." "Eli," he told her. Saying his name was a strange, small humiliation. Most people called him Turner's boy or left him to the wind. It was the first time in a long while someone had called him by a name, and the sound of it felt like a hand on his back. He thought of his sister then, the memory sharp as a needle, her small sled riding behind the house, the squeak of the runners, the way she had laughed once when he'd mended the strap on her mitten. She had died the winter before, fever and a cough the town did not notice in time. The grief had taught him two things: how quickly life could be taken by weather and neglect, and how meaningless most people considered small losses. He did not think then of heroics, only of the motion of keeping a child warm. The wind pressed at the hollows of his ears and made the world a white reef. He wrapped Kaya tighter, hoisted her across his shoulders in the way he'd seen men carry bags, and began the walk back toward Red River Crossing. He could have ridden a horse from the outskirts, had any been willing to meet a storm, but he was quicker on foot and closer. The path back was a series of lithe calculations, where the snow would fetch at your ankles, where the wind would find you like a trap, which hollows might hold the breath of the land, and let your steps stay true. The town looked smaller through the snow, rooflines blurred into ground. Mrs. Hanley's place was a square of darker wood with smoke leaning out like a hand. He reached her barn first, ducking under the eaves and into stark shadow where the storm's teeth could not bite. The barn was a neighbor's heart, a small stove, a stack of hay smelling like late summer, a horse that stamped and whickered, the brine of livery. He set Kaya on a bale, wrapped her face from the wind, and drew the stove into life with a keen hand. Sparks blinked in the gloom. He pulled off his own wet layers and wrapped them in canvas to be taken by Mrs. Hanley's cook while he warmed by the stove, his breath loud and white. Mrs. Hanley was a tall woman, with hair that had once been black and now lived in streaks of iron, the kind of person who kept the town's moral ledger on a shelf behind her sternness. She had taken Eli in after his father had left, and his mother had been too soft a thing to stand in a world with sharp edges. She had a soft place she generally hid under a thick crust of common sense. When Eli carried a child into her barn, she did not begin with the questions the others would ask later. She began with a blanket. She moved with a quickness that belied her shape, and she arranged furs as if folding a small life into a nest. The barn smelled of cast iron, horse sweat, and the faint sweetness of molasses. Kaya's breath came easier. She clicked a tongue against her teeth and searched the child's face as if the answer might be found in the curl of an eyelash. She recognized no mark for the little medallion, but she knew the look of a child who had come too close to the knife edge of cold. "Sheriff Taylor will want to know," she said at last, in the practical voice adults use when assigning worry to a place where it can be handled. "And Merrick will want announcements. Folks will be frightened." Her hands were steady as she handed Eli a cup of watered tea. "You did good, boy." He looked at her, and for a moment the boy in him wanted only the simple warmth of being applauded. He sipped the tea and felt the heat crawl down like a ladder. Back in town, a committee had formed before the snow had lessened. A small orchestra of voices convened under the rough shelter of worry. Sheriff Taylor, a barrel-chested man used to being listened to, had a ledger of law for everything that might happen. Mr. Merrick, who ran the general store, had a ledger of price and loss, and he favored decisions that kept any threat from cutting into his shelves. They clustered at the Hanley smokehouse and argued with the kind of measured fury that comes from people used to small-world consequences. "How long might her people be gone?" Merrick asked, trying to make the future a business proposition. "A day? 2? If they come looking for her, if they come 100 strong, what will we do? We can't be responsible for a massacre." "You don't know that," Sheriff Taylor replied, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He was not cruel, he was cautious. "If they come, it'll be with fire." Mrs. Hanley stood with a dish towel in her hand and the kettle hissing behind her. She had seen the town turn from compassion to suspicion more often than she wanted to tally. "Or they'll come to take back what's theirs," she said. "Or they'll come to say thanks. You act like there's no other way than bullets." "Mrs. Hanley," Merrick began, a protest ready in his mouth. "You forget," she cut him off. "This isn't a market stall to be bartered. It's a child. You would have us hand a child back to strangers in the cold without asking who she belongs to?" Her question hung in the room. It was half chastisement, half plea. Around her, old alliances and resentments folded into themselves like paper in someone's pocket. The town had reasons to be afraid. A skirmish near a trading post 2 weeks earlier had left a family's barn burnt and 2 men gone. Rumor had teeth and it chewed at nights. But fear is often louder than facts, and in the long hours of waiting, it grew into a thing of its own. Eli heard the words from behind the barn door and felt them like wind off a cliff, that the peace could break quickly if misread. Inside, Kaya sat up and accepted a slice of bread Mrs. Hanley offered. She ate slowly, letting the warmth carry through her. She ran a thumb over the carved medallion at her throat and watched the barn's light as if it were a distant sun. She could say some things in English that she had learned from trading days and other small contacts, but most of her words were those of a camp and a tent and a river. She said little about the night she had been lost. Her face kept a narrow reservation of memory, like a coin held out of sight. Eli carved for Kaya a small wooden horse in the barn's dim, with a whittling knife he had bought with a winter's worth of coins scraped together from odd jobs and saved for an uncertain future. He had watched other children play with wooden toys once, and remembering the small pleasure in giving it away felt like the right shape for his hands. The horse was rough and lopsided, but honest. He offered it as if the offering itself might make something whole again. Kaya's fingers closed around the horse, and for a second they shared a simple commerce that had nothing to do with law or fear or rumors. She tapped the medallion at her throat with the horse's nose, then placed the horse in Eli's palm and smiled with a confusion that made the corners of her eyes crinkle. It was the clearest kind of thank you, not a language, but the way a person moves their body to say, "I have received." That night the wind kept up its litany. Eli slept in a chair by the stove, his scarf over his face, and dreamt of a little sled and his sister's laugh. When he woke, the storm had loosened its teeth but not let go. Snow whipped in the distance. The town moved with the slow deliberation of creatures who had been watching something dangerous and refused to turn their heads away. Across the rise of the river, in a camp set far enough away to be its own shadow, Chief Chaska kept his own vigil. He was a man whose body carried the print of years, shoulders built for the weight of responsibility, eyes that had learned to read the sky for meaning. The camp was a ring of tipis, smoke rising in the thin mornings, ponies huddled behind lower slopes, women tending small fires, and elders telling stories to boys who liked the burn of words on a cold night. Kaya had been more than a granddaughter. She was part of Chaska's lineage, a small piece of a larger family web. When he learned she was gone, each step he took toward finding her was measured not in anger, but in obligation. There are laws that are older than the treaties written on paper, laws of reciprocity, of honor. And to Chaska, a missing child was a wound to be bound. He thought of the faces of his people when they woke, and discovered the empty space where a small life should have been. He thought of how scouts had tracked her tiny prints against the snow, how the wind measured the direction of her travel, and how the river might have frightened a child into a wrong turn. He called for riders, not because he wanted to wage a war, but because he wanted to retrieve and to ensure that the wrong done was righted, in the face of a town that might not welcome a small girl back to her own. 500 men could mean many things. It could be a force of war or a sea of protection. Chaska chose the latter. He ordered the riders assembled not to storm the town, but to present a presence that could not be ignored, to show the scale of his people's care for one small life. He understood how fear in small communities could turn simple kindness into a dangerous thing. He preferred certainty. When a man carries a child into the hands of strangers, he wants to know the terms on which that child is returned. He wanted Kaya home, and he wanted the town to know that the taking back would be done with ceremony and with words that bound. No one in Red River Crossing expected a maneuver so intentional. Men and women there often thought in the language of small skirmishes and immediate losses. They had not measured the depth of obligation in the camps across the river. The next morning, when the horizon cleared like a lid and the snow settled into glitter, something moved against the pale sky. Eli was out by the river, checking the snares he had left lines along the drift to ensure the town had some meat if the winter proved long. He saw, as if a curtain had been pulled back, a line of movement along the ridge. At first he thought they were black knots, ponies and riders bunched together, and his breath thinned from the cold. Then he realized the line was long, impossibly long, a wave of motion rolling across the white like a tide of dark horses. Hooves lifted, coats tossed, the small clatter that made him press his hand to his chest as if to anchor himself. They were not running. The riders kept a steady pace, a cadence like a heart. From where Eli stood, they looked like a living fence, and he felt the world narrow until it was only him and the sound and the thought of Kaya inside. He could see the flagging of fabric here and there, the glint on a boosted head. He could see an elder moving with them with a grace that made him think of someone stepping into history. At the head rode Chief Chaska, not on a beast toward battle, but on a measured trajectory that said the matter at hand demanded gravity. Eli's first instinct was a young boy's fear that the town's worst thing had come to pass. He ran back toward the Hanley barn with the speed of someone who had nothing left to lose. He wanted to tell Mrs. Hanley and the sheriff, and the men gathered like a frayed rope at the meeting house. People spilled out into the cold like moths alarmed by some new heat. From the town's highest point, the line of riders filled the horizon. Voices stilled. It felt as though the wind itself had taken off its gloves. The sound of hooves was a drumbeat that matched the blood at Eli's temples. Sheriff Taylor squared his shoulders as men do when a distant threat becomes a near fact. Merrick's face had gone the color of old paper. He set his jaw as if to hold the ledger of his fears closed. Mrs. Hanley set her hands on Kaya's shoulders and looked out at the riders as if she could decide for the child by sheer will. Chaska's riders slowed as they approached the river crossing. Their formation broke into smaller groups, men dismounting quietly as if to break bread rather than fight. They left a gap in the field for the town to fill with its own answer. A low, measured chant rose from the riders, not loud enough to be threatening, but deep enough to be understood as the kinship sound of a community. Eli stood at the front of the town square, small beneath the wide sky. He felt a hand at his elbow and looked to see Kaya's dark eyes watching the horizon through the down of her breath. She touched the carved horse at her throat and gave it a small, steadying squeeze. Sheriff Taylor met Chief Chaska halfway across the wooden bridge that arched like a spine over the Red River. The two men stopped and regarded one another as men who knew the weight of years, stopping to settle its dust. They spoke a few words that passed like stones across the water, measured phrases, then silence like water listening. Chaska dismounted slowly, his shoulders carrying not the day's cold, but the lineage of responsibility. He walked forward, and his bare feet on the planks made no unnecessary sound. He approached Kaya, and the child ran forward between a break in the crowd and fell into the chief's arms. He stooped, pressed his forehead to hers, in a gesture Eli had only ever seen old men make in quiet, private moments of mercy. It was a small, profound thing. The crowd inhaled as if they had been held in a long pause. Then Chief Chaska looked up, and his eyes found Eli. For a heartbeat, everything else evaporated. The town, the river, the wind, all of it narrowed to that gaze. Chaska stepped forward in a way that was neither show nor threat. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a carved pendant, a small piece of wood or bone or stone that had been marked with care by hands Eli could not name. He did not speak of it as a power, but as a binding. "What comes next will ask more of you than any ledger can hold," Chaska said, his voice carried by a translator and by looks and by the plainness of his manner. He placed the pendant around Eli's neck with the same attentive movement he might use to lay a blanket over a sleeping child. The pendant rested at Eli's chest like a promise, and once on him, the riders raised neither club nor shout, but only bowed their heads in a manner that was both salute and benediction. For reasons that would not all be spoken that day, the circle the riders formed was not meant to close like a trap. They had come to take the child home. They had come to do it in a way that declared the town would be seen and the child would be honored. Chaska's action, the pendant, the touch, the straight words, rewrote the moment. It made of fear an obligation, and obligations are laws that both sides must obey. The first people who found their voices afterward did not shout accusations. They spoke like people waking up, with an awkward gratitude and an even more awkward shame. The town, for all its arguments, had sheltered a child. The camp had gathered a force that refused to be ignored. The line between them had become a place where a choice must be made. Eli felt the pendant heavy against his shirt. He had thought himself small, invisible. The weight at his throat made him feel seen in a way that was at once uncomfortable and alchemically true. It was not a medal for bravery, nor a key to a house he did not own. It was a claim of protection and of reciprocity, a public naming that had consequences the ledger could not tally. Behind them, the riders settled. Their horses stamped and pawed. The river flowed indifferent and relentless. The sky above them was a stretch of pale, indifferent blue, punctured by the hawk of wind that still wanted to finish its work. The town gathered, and in that gathering words shifted and promises found their contours. Some faces said they would never be the same for having seen what they had seen. Others wore the beginning of respect, like a new coat. Eli's hands trembled against the pendant. He could not have told the language of obligation and honor that had just been laid upon him. He only knew that when Chaska's riders turned to leave, the motion was not a retreat. It was the closure of a loop. They moved away like the tide, their lines folding back into the land that had raised them. But a departure is not an end. It is a question left in the air. What will the town do now that a child has been honored with protection from a people they feared? What will Eli do, wearing a pendant that marked him in front of both camps? What will Kaya remember from the small hands that saved her? And how will the town remember the day they decided together whether to lean into fear or step toward a new kind of neighbor? Eli stood at the river's edge and felt the pendant against his ribs, the carved edges knocking faintly on his shirt with every breath. He watched the line of riders pull back over the ridge until they were no more than dark dots against the snow. Then he felt along his fist the splintered wood of the little horse he'd carved, and let the slow, deep sound that had begun in his chest subside into something steadier. The town turned to tend to the small things, to stock up, to patch roofs, to speak in curt and cautious sentences about trades and boundaries. But beneath the ordinary, a new current had begun. People who had not spoken before found themselves looking at one another differently. Sometimes eyes met and held, sometimes they dropped. The pendant at Eli's throat was a small thing that would grow into a story, and stories have a shape as stubborn as winter. Farther upstream, where the river carved the land and the grass leaned like a chorus toward the water, the riders slowed and came together again with their elders and medicine keepers. Chief Chaska dismounted and walked among them, his feet sure on the frozen ground. There was no boast in him, only history and careful hands. He had watched a child lifted from the snow into another people's care and had seen a boy give himself without calculation. That fact had been enough to bring 500 men. What they had done would be told to families and to children, and folded into lines of trust, whether the town liked it or not. It would be remembered in the way stories are, by telling and by the slow work of repeated small acts. In the days that would follow, the town would rearrange itself around the knowledge that a single small act could bend the arc of things. But in the moment when the riders were still a dark seam along the ridge, Eli did not see future alliances or carved markers. He saw only the blunted edge of a winter day, a small girl's palm no bigger than his thumb, and the steady, inexplicable weight of a pendant that meant he was not invisible any longer. If there is a place where the world can alter its course, it is often in such a narrow space. A child saved from snow, a chief who chooses a ceremony instead of a sword, a town that must reckon with what honor costs. The river kept moving, the wind kept speaking, and for Eli Turner, the path he had stumbled onto under the pressure of cold and pity had become something else entirely, the beginning of an obligation he would carry like a map, one carved in wood and bead and small human promises. They would speak of that morning for years. Parents would hush children with the tale of the boy who carried a child through the storm. Traders would nod when crossing the Red River and tip their hats to a pendant whose meaning had been plain and complicated all at once. The wooden horse would sit on a shelf in a home that had been made public by kindness. The river would remember each footfall impressed in its bank. But for now, as Eli watched the last of the riders dissolve into the white, he felt the tightness in his chest and the unfamiliar instruction in his hands. He picked up the carved horse and tucked it under his arm, and then he walked back to the barn where Mrs. Hanley waited with more blankets and questions that would take time to answer. From across the ridge there came a distant low singing, not the kind a man raises to make noise, but a long, steady sound that reminded him of how the land had been before names were written upon it. He listened until the sound thinned and the snow moved, and then he turned toward the house. The river's bridge held, the town breathed, and somewhere between the river and the ridge, a new story had begun to shape itself around small kindness and the public declarations that would force both sides to keep to a new kind of promise. Eli did not yet know the cost. He only knew the shape of what had been given him. He felt the weight of it against his chest and the warm horse against his palm. The town would have to decide if they would walk into the obligation with him or step away when the next storm came. He looked back once more at the ridge where the riders had been, and then set his shoulders to the long walk home, the pendant thudding softly with each step like a heartbeat, making room for a future none of them had chosen, but all of them would inherit. He crossed the yard with his shoulders set against the wind, the pendant tapping once, then twice against the fabric of his shirt, as if it were finding a rhythm of its own. Inside the barn, the stove had gone low. Mrs. Hanley sat mending a sleeve, her face folded into the task. Kaya slept on a pile of furs, the carved horse tucked beneath her chin like a talisman against dreams. Eli laid the animal beside her and felt, for the first time since he had been small, that being seen had a cost as well as a warmth. The first days that followed were measured in small reckonings. The town did not change overnight. Habits ossified like river ice and were slow to thaw, but the presence of the pendant altered the tone of argument. Men who had used fear as shorthand for safety found that their ledger entries no longer held the same power when a chief's word had been spoken in public and a child had been returned without a shot fired. Sheriff Taylor, careful by nature, called a council. It was not the formal sort you saw in cities, but a gathering nonetheless, held at the meeting house with benches pushed together into a circle and a kettle steaming on the hearth. Chief Chaska sent elders who could speak plainly in the trading dialect and who knew how to turn long obligations into simple terms, protection in return for care, respect in return for recognition. The words were not written. They were made by hands and sealed by the visible pendant and by the sight of 500 riders who had come because a life was missing. Mr. Merrick argued for a list of guarantees at first, proof, treaties, assurances that trade would not be interrupted, but found himself softening when he watched Kaya slip bread into her pocket and give a shy, deliberate bow the way she had been shown. He announced grudgingly that supplies would be set aside when riders came to trade, and he offered flour at a price that was not steep for the winter. It was a small thing, and yet it was a pattern that could be followed. Mrs. Hanley, whose moral ledger had once only collected debts, realized that shelter bore a new meaning. She volunteered to teach the town's women how to care for small ailments in ways that did not require a doctor in every case. And in exchange, the Lakota women showed her how to braid cord for snowshoes and how to read the weather by the way smoke curled from a teepee. None of these lessons named rituals or revealed sacred items. They were practical, human. They were the sort of knowledge that allowed two strangers to shelter each other when the night turned its face away from everyone. For his part, Eli was pulled into a role without ceremony, but with every expectation. The pendant had marked him publicly. Chief Chaska had not simply given a token, but a charge. In private, after the horses had been watered and the riders had been fed, Chaska spoke to Eli with a steadiness that did not lecture. He told the boy that the pendant was a statement, one that said the child he had saved was now also his people's concern, and that those who carried that concern would expect the town to answer in kind. "You are small," Chaska said, turning the pendant in the light as if to study the grain, "but small hands do many things. We do not measure a man's worth by his height. We measure it by the care he gives. Keep this, and you will know when someone looks to you." His words were not heavy with poetry. They were simple as bread and twice as necessary. Eli learned quickly that the charge was not only to be protected, but to act as a bridge. He began with errands. He carried messages between the Hanley house and the camp. He led riders by safe paths when the snow disguised hazards. He translated a few words between languages until his voice could smooth the sharpness of misunderstanding. That work taught him how to be patient, how to listen for meanings that were not said, and for silences that held the same weight as speech. Kaya, for her part, recovered with a quickness that seemed almost casual for someone so near defeat. Children have a way of reassembling themselves that adults often forget. She visited her camp in the first formal return. An event arranged with the care of people who understood how fragile peace could be, and Eli walked with her to the ridge, where tipis dotted the plain like low hills. Chaska met them with a small party. The chief pressed his forehead once to Kaya's, a private greeting, and then to Eli's in acknowledgement. The gesture was not a gift to be explained. It was the giving of a place in a long web. The pendant did more than identify him. It opened doors. Men who had once ignored Eli began to ask him for counsel when a message needed gentleness. Mothers in town watched him with new eyes, not as a boy to be scolded for mischief, but as someone whose actions might ripple beyond the stack of their own concerns. There were whispers, some admiring, some sour, but the public nature of Chaska's declaration made it harder for fear to turn into cruelty. To break a person who had been publicly protected invited trouble from more than one side. Spring moved on its slow calendar. The ice let go of the river, with a sound like a held breath released. Streams smelled of thaw and iron. The first time Eli stood on the bridge, after the hard freeze, a child from the camp came to stand beside him. Her moccasins left dotted prints along the plank. "Tashina," she said, his name in the language he was learning, and then giggled when he stumbled over a response. They traded small things like birds trade songs. Kaya, the carved horse, Eli, a knotted little rope that had been good for tying snares. Over the next months there were scenes that might have seemed ordinary to a stranger, but were in fact stitches in a new seam. A hunting party from the camp and a group of townsmen trapped a fox close to Rabbit's Hollow and shared the meat around a fire. A child burned by scalding tea was brought from the Hanley porch to a tent where elders taught a compress method that soothed without elaborate ritual. A horse with a splintered hoof was ferried from a field to a farrier in town with men from both sides steadying it. None of these acts solved the deep and historic grievances that lay beneath the land, but they did change the way people looked at one another when the wind blew cold. Not everyone was pleased. There were grumblings from those who liked their fears neat, who preferred the ledger of us and them because it kept calculations simple. Mr. Merrick grumbled one market day when a pack of riders came in and walked out with more than they had taken in coins. "We're being taken for fools," he muttered to Sheriff Taylor. But Taylor, who had watched the wide line of riders with his own measure of worry, had begun to see another kind of accounting. "They came for a child and left with words," he said. "Words are safer than bullets. Maybe that's what the town needed." Eli found himself at the center of a dozen quiet dramas. He taught a few boys how to whittle, showing them how to hold a piece of wood so the knife would not bite the thumb. He learned in turn to braid rawhide and to listen for a horse's breath as a way to judge how far it had traveled. Chief Chaska started sending riders with him to watch the river and the crossing, not as soldiers, but as escorts. The idea was simple. A boy who knew routes could protect others. A rider who belonged to a camp could walk the same line and show harmless intent. Over time, escorts became a regular part of crossings, short rides in daylight, dances of dust and horsehair crossing the plain with packs tied on, and children watching from both sides. One summer, when grass grew tall and mosquitoes hunched on the river, an illness moved through the trading post. It was a fever that did not reach the level of panic, but enough to worry parents. The town doctor was called, but he was few and tired. Chaska invited a few women to sit with the doctor, and the two communities pooled their knowledge. There was no drama in the cooperation, no mystical cure, no borrowed rites. But there were steady hands and warm cloths and careful watching. People who had once crossed the street to avoid a rider now brought bowls of soup to a teepee and sat on a log to offer company. As the years threaded one into another, Eli matured in ways that were not immediately obvious. He grew taller. His face gained the angles of someone who moved in weather. He spoke in a voice that had learned to shape questions gently. He wore the pendant at times on a strip of leather, at others tucked beneath his shirt like something secret. The pendant's meaning shifted from its first raw public purpose to a private reminder. Obligations must be met, and when you are the messenger, you carry the choices of many. Kaya became both friend and teacher. She grew into a young woman who could ride near any herd and read the horse's mood with a glance. Sometimes she visited Red River Crossing with baskets of gathered roots and trade goods. Sometimes she stayed at the Hanley house for a week and taught the town girls how to braid their hair in a fashion that made them look like sisters. Children from both camps began to play together, where the river's bend made a small sandy shoal. They built boats of bark and raced them, their shouts knitting air between them. There were moments of tension. Old grievances are like buried stones that the plough sometimes uncovers. Once, a boy from town stole a piece of beadwork from a lightbox in Merrick's store and gave it to a friend as a token. The theft was discovered, and a rider from the camp came that evening to speak. The town gathered in a hush as Sheriff Taylor and an elder exchanged words. There was a knowing look between men who both understood shame. The boy returned the beadwork the next morning and, in front of witnesses, apologized. Consequences were not violent. A fine was agreed upon, service at a communal harvest, and a day at the camp helping mend teepees. And the matter settled into a lesson that many parents pointed to when their children asked what it meant to be part of a larger thing. In quieter ways, the relationship deepened into ritual that was not ritual but habit. Once a year, in late autumn, delegations from each side met at the small wooden marker that Eli later carved and placed near the bridge. They brought a bundle, maybe a sack of flour, maybe a stitched blanket, and left it for those who needed it most. Children would gather and listen as elders told the story of the night the snow nearly took a child and a boy did not look away. The story was told differently each time. Not to alter facts, but to keep the telling alive. Sometimes it was Kaya who would speak, sometimes Eli. Sometimes it was a trader with a faraway accent who had been present that first year and whose voice had softened by the time he told the tale. The wooden marker itself began as a small private thing. Eli carved it from a post left over from the bridge repairs, smoothing the grain and chiseling 2 sets of small footprints, one larger, one small, into the wood. He did not ask permission to place it. He simply drove it into the riverbank at a place where 2 paths crossed and people could pause. When the town took notice, they called it a monument. When Chaska's camp saw it, they called it a reminder. Either way, the marker became a place where children left painted stones and where elders sometimes sat to speak of the price and the gift of looking after one another. Time, relentless and generous, kept moving. Eli grew into a young man who could sit with Chief Chaska and talk of the land with something like equality. He married later than many, an arrangement quiet and without fanfare, with a woman from a mixed heritage family who had learned both the sewing skills of the town and the lessons of the camp. Their house stood near the Hanley place, with a small garden fenced against rabbits. Kaya became an aunt to many and a leader to some. She learned to negotiate treaties of grazing rights and to stand at the bridge on days when negotiations turned prickly. Her voice had the steady, soft quality of someone who had once been close to the edge of death and had been taught by experience how to value minimal things. Chief Chaska passed on with a winter that was hard and full of wind. He left the pendant to be kept in the camp as a symbol and instructed that a child should be chosen each year to learn the names of both the town and the camp people. His funeral was not a public spectacle in the way towns celebrated generals. It was a measured circle around a man who had carried years with care. Eli stood among the riders who had once numbered 500 and felt again the long arc of obligation. He spoke at the burial, not with high words, but with the plainness that Chaska had valued. "He taught us to measure a life by what we will do for one another," he said. "That is the only treaty I know I can keep." The years layered one onto the other. Children who had grown up hearing the story of the boy and the pendant grew into adults who pointed to the wooden marker when they wanted to teach their little ones about courage. Traders who once feared crossing the river now left open accounts with the camp and trusted riders who had been vetted by the town. There were seasons of plenty and seasons of meagre returns. In both, the pattern of reciprocity held with the grubby stubbornness of roots. Eli kept his role quiet. He delivered messages, settled small disputes, taught boys how to read tracks in snow and girls where the good berries grew in summer. He was not a man of grand speeches. He had been a child who had chosen to pull one life from the snow, and that choice had set a long chain of small actions into motion. Blankets shared, a store's ledger loosened at times, a sheriff more willing to ask questions than to assume guilt. He watched as the children of both camps learned to greet one another, and as the wooden horse he had carved passed hands and then returned, worn soft by fingers. Time also changed how the story was told. Along the river, the tale took on a whisper of the extraordinary, as stories do. A boy who had been invisible became someone who forced the town to examine itself. 500 men had come, the retelling would say, and the retelling was right. But the fuller truth, that they had come to honor a child, to insist on a code that was more than ledger or fear, was the only part that mattered to those who had lived it. In one of the last scenes of his life, Eli walked the bridge at dawn and found a small crowd gathered for the annual meeting by the marker. Children darted about, and an old Mrs. Hanley, stooped now but still with fingers that could mend a sleeve, smiled at the sight of a small girl from town braiding a ribbon into a camp child's hair. Sheriff Taylor's grandson, Sheriff Taylor's corpse, long ago returned to the earth, stood next to a rider who had once been part of Chaska's reserve. They were, in small ways, proof of the work that obligations could make when people chose them. Eli touched the pendant he still wore sometimes when the weather grew raw. It had been smoothed by time and by the many hands that had clasped it, but it sat the same against his chest, a reminder that he did not own the safety it represented. He had, in his time, carried more than messages. He had carried people's expectations and their disappointments, and seldom their gratitude. He had learned to be steady. He had learned that steadiness sometimes looked like silence, and sometimes like quick hands that could cut bandage or mount a horse. Years after the winter that had changed everything, an old man of the town, one who had been a youth when the riders had first come, carved an extended plaque to set beside Eli's marker. Not a marble, but a plank of oak with the town's name and the year, and 2 sets of footprints. People gathered to hear the reading. Children who had been fed by both camps sat cross-legged on the grass and listened. Kaya, now with hair braided and fringed with tiny shells that tinkled when she moved, stood beside Eli and touched his arm. She had a granddaughter with her, a girl who tugged at her skirt and watched everything with the kind of intensity that makes grown people soft. Eli, his voice thin but steady, spoke not of himself. He told the tale as if it were a map, pointing out where choices had been made that would not always be easy to repeat. He closed with a sentence, simple and clear. We did not promise to forget the wrongs of the world. We promised only to not add to them, the crowd murmured, and a child asked a bright question about the first snow. As sunlight struck the snow that afternoon, the pendant twinkled on Eli's chest like a small, private star. The riders who came from the camp still had no uniform for their presence. They came as kin. They cared for the dead. They shared meat in lean times. They kept their words. Traders who had once counted their losses in bullets now kept their accounts in trust. When Eli died, an old man whose hands were still good with a knife and whose stories yawed generous and wide, the marker bore flowers and trinkets. The town and the camp shared the burial, and there were words of thanks and songs that moved not for spectacle, but for the way music can make grief into a bridge. Kaya placed her forehead to his, in the same private way Chaska had once done, and pressed something small into the pendant's leather. A lock of hair from the first mare she had ever ridden. It was a private thing and public all at once. The wooden marker remained, its two little footprints worn and smoothed by weather and touch, and the story continued to be told. Travelers would stop, tip their hats, and if asked, tell the simple truth, that a boy had saved a child, and 500 had come not to fight but to bind. People who tended the marker repainted it when the rain ate the paint away. Children pressed coins into a small split in the base and made wishes that, as wishes go, were more about food and play than treaties. At times, in the hush between midday and the river's steady work, you could still hear the wind speak along the plain. It sounded less like threat now, and more like memory, the wind reminding people of how cold had once been, and how small hands had once decided to do something that sounded, at first, like a single foolish kindness. That foolishness, multiplied by a chief's dignity and a town's slow willingness to change, became a pattern that mattered beyond the town. It became the way people defined themselves, by little acts that refused the easy answer. The wooden horse sat on a shelf in a house that was neither holy town nor holy camp. It was varnished and nicked, and sometimes lent to children who wanted to know what a brave little thing looked like up close. The pendant, its edges softened, hung in a place of honor at the camp and was shown to visitors as an emblem of what had been asked of both towns and riders, and those who made the decision to answer. Years from that winter, when a teacher asked a classroom of children to name a moment when someone's small act had changed a larger story, many hands shot up. They told tales of a boy with a pendant, of a carved horse, of 500 riders who had come across the ridge like a tide. Some mixed the details, ever the way stories do, but the kernel remained, a life saved and a people who decided to show up for it. The river continued as it always had, indifferent and steady, carving its own slow path. The bridge stood and was mended when necessary. The wooden marker weathered and was replaced and weathered again, a perpetual note on the bank. Whenever winter returned fierce and white, a small knot of people from town and camp would gather, and someone would make sure blankets and bread were ready for those who might need them. It was, in the simplest sense, the continuation of one boy's small decision to move toward a voice in the snow, rather than away from it. And so the story folded back on itself like a map, with its edges turning. The day a child was rescued beneath a hard sky had become, in the end, more than an anecdote for traders or a cautionary example for children. It had become a living lesson that honor, once declared, compels action, that small acts of compassion can force communities to reckon and sometimes to choose better. The pendant meant protection not because of magic, but because people had agreed to honor the word it represented. On the riverbank, where Eli had once stood, the wooden marker remained, two small footprints carved into its face. Parents still pointed to it and told their children how fear could be met by courage that was neither loud nor showy. The story had become a sort of compass that one could consult in times when it was easier to withdraw. If you ever find your feet on that bridge, if you ever stand where the water folds the land and listen to the wind, you might feel for a moment the slow pull of the past and the sense that a small, decent act can stretch farther than it seemed at first. Eli Turner had been 13 when he took a child from the snow. He was remembered as a young hero because he had chosen a small kindness in a big, cold world. 500 riders had come to the ridge that morning, not to settle a score, but to honor a child and to declare, in a way the town could not ignore, the price and gift of looking out for one another. If this moved you, like and share, so this story of unlikely courage reaches others.